Linux Luddites, episode 70, for the 25th of January, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. So let's start this Linux podcast by talking about Windows. No, not the fact that Microsoft has seemingly come over all cuddly towards the open source community, but the slightly harsher reality that many of us still find ourselves at least occasionally running Windows, whether that's for work or simply to play the latest blockbuster game. We were thinking about this, and Joe suggested we take a look at ReactOS, which promises to provide Windows compatibility without sacrificing on free software ideals. We'll find out how well it delivers after the news. And later, after your feedback, we spin up a couple of the less well-known browsers to see if they have what it takes to challenge the dominance of Chrome and the rapidly self-destructing Firefox on the Linux desktop. But before we get into all of that, what have you guys been up to since last time?
Well, it's nothing that I've been particularly up to, messing around with various computer things. And it occurred to me, I've got a question. So I've got an Ubuntu server, and I'm sure many of our listeners do, or at least some other server. And on it, when I installed it, I selected the automatic security package install, so I didn't have to go into it every day or every week or what have you. And I can just go in and update just the programs that I use on it. And that is a package called automatic-upgrades. And it's sort of, I wonder, well, if you install Ubuntu on someone's PC that you don't see very often, we always talk about, your cousin's PC or your nan's PC or something, why are we not installing that as default? Why is that not more widely used as a way of ensuring that they always get security updates, and then when you see them every 3 months, 6 months, you update their programs so that you're there in case something funny goes on with the displays or things? And to that end, why aren't I installing it on my Ubuntu install? Because then it just updates in the background and I don't have to constantly think about whether or not I'm having to upgrade my security patches. So what do you think about that?
Well, I've got a desktop machine which is on most of the time, I would say, apart from when I'm asleep. And of course I installed it on that because why not? I generally don't do it on laptops because they tend to be on and off a lot more. But on any machine that's going to be on for an extended period of time, it just makes perfect sense to install unattended upgrades.
I suppose where I'm coming from is I was surprised that I hadn't really heard of it. And I found out about it through setting up my server and sort of digging around in it and fiddling about. And it's just a package I'd never really heard of. And I think it should be more widely used. As you explained, a computer that's always on, it might as well do its updates in the background. Is it something you use, Paddy?
Always on servers, I do. I've just sat here trying to think why I don't on the desktop. I think it's probably because I've got a button which is configured. When I click it, it does apt-get update and apt-get upgrade and an auto-remove as well, just to keep my box clean. And I'm just in the habit of clicking that every day. But yeah, on servers, I always use unattended upgrades.
But as for someone else's PC that you're setting up, I think that's a brilliant idea. I think I'm actually going to do that on my mum's laptop next time I go and see her because, yeah, why not?
Well, it seems like it wasn't such a stupid idea after all. Okay, excellent. Let's get on with the news.
First up then, the tragic news that the Mozilla Persona login system is going to shut down at the end of November. I'm going to miss it terribly, guys. I don't know about you.
Yeah, what am I going to do with all those sites that I use it to log in with?
Right. I have to admit, I hadn't heard of it until Paddy put this in the news. Although it sounds like quite a good idea that you just sign up once with Mozilla and then can log into all sorts of websites like you can with Facebook and stuff. But instead of having to trust Facebook, you trust in Mozilla. And I know we like to criticize them quite a lot, but I know which one I'd prefer to trust.
Yeah, well, this was really why I stuck it in the news, because it goes back to the comments I was making when we were talking about Mozilla and actually trying to keep them alive as an organization. And I find this really disappointing. I mean, it was long announced, I have to say. They'd said they were going to do this last year. They've just set a definite date on it now. They divested themselves and just handed it over to the community last year. But it is disappointing, and I really think they're missing a trick by not positioning themselves as the organisation on the internet you can trust. And you can trust to have data like login details. You can trust to handle micropayments, as one of the listeners suggested to us recently as well. There's a whole heap of trust issues out there. No one trusts Facebook. No one trusts Google. And why Mozilla isn't trying to plough that furrow, I really got no idea whatsoever.
Yeah, it's interesting you point out that people don't trust the big players like Google and Facebook. Joe and I went to an open hardware jam last year, and there was a lady that we interviewed for the show, and she was saying in her talk that she was going through a sort of questionnaire process where they would show people the logon and then ask them questions about how secure they felt it was and whether or not they were happy to use that service. And what they did in one of the stages was to say, well, people may not want to have another logon on a computer. You know, we all get bogged down with passwords and things. So they added an option to sign in with Facebook. And I can't remember if it was Google as well, but certainly one of Facebook and maybe the other one. And people actually felt it was worse because they didn't want Facebook to know even more about them or find out what sort of sites they were going to. And so having a Facebook login was deterring people from feeling it was secure. Whereas, as you say, if Mozilla are a trusted and known organization on the internet for that sort of thing, then maybe it would have more of an impact. But I do have to disagree slightly because while the points you make are fair, we have on the past shows criticised Mozilla for having too many things going on and having too many eggs in too many baskets or some sort of metaphor and not really focusing on what they need to do. And so it's maybe a bit unfair of us to say as soon as they start shedding some of their projects to then criticise them again for shedding them rather than having too many.
Yeah, I think my criticism would be on focus because they've adopted a very scattergun approach in the past and basically just been throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And unfortunately, very little of it has. I mean, my argument was that they should actually redefine their mission somewhat and focus on security and trust issues. And I could see a bright future for them if they went down that path, but they've clearly got no interest in doing so.
Well, as a slight tangent from the Mozilla discussion, one of their former CEOs, Brendan Eich, who resigned over some Proposition 8 things going on and who he supported and homophobia, but we can put all that behind us because we covered it in a previous news segment.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a little naive to say he resigned. He was pushed out, really, wasn't he?
Okay, yeah, there was some backlash and he was pushed out. So he has now announced a new company called Brave and their new web browser called Brave based on Chromium, and he's trying to sort of target it as the fix to advertising and the problem with tracking and things like this. So the idea is that he purges all the ads and makes sure there's no tracking and no cookies and things like this. And he says that if you were to use Ghostery, Disconnect.me and AdBlock Plus with some tweaking, you'd get roughly to where they are. So he's sort of incorporating those sort of functionalities. And the odd thing is that where he's removed ads using AdBlock, he's then going to reinsert them, but with a new advertising revenue system. So the idea here is that the publishers would get about 55% of the revenue from the clicks that go through, 15% would go to Brave to fund their project, 15% to the partners that supplied the ads, so there's other middlemen involved, and then, in a sort of slightly odd system, the remaining percentages go to the user in sort of a micropayment type way. And so it's quite different. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but the point that I quite like that his setup has is that if you've clicked on an advert and therefore paid someone in sort of air quotes, you won't get adverts on that website. So perhaps you've clicked on a Toyota advert and when you go to the Toyota website, you won't get more adverts.
Yeah, and my understanding is that's what's happening to the 15% that's going to the user's pocket. It doesn't actually appear in your bank account. It's sort of kept as a credit against other websites, so you could nominate, say, the New York Times as a website you don't ever see adverts on, and therefore they would take money out of your 15% to reimburse the New York Times for any lost advertising revenue.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and you mentioned it was based on Chromium. It is on some platforms. My understanding, again, is that they've got a whole different raft of browsers they're using. I think on Apple it's going to be Firefox, and on Android they're going to be using Bubble, which they bought a while back. So it's not so much a browser platform we're talking about here as an actual business model.
It sounds like a reasonable business model, and I think that it could be attractive to some people, but the browser market's pretty much sewn up at this point, isn't it, with Chrome? I mean, is the average person really going to change their browser from the default one? I suppose Chrome proved that they will, but that's because Google pushed it so hard. And I remember a friend of mine who is getting on, let's say, in years, and he's fairly new to computers. And I went around and he was using Chrome. I said to him, how come you're using that? He said, I just thought it was an update. And so that's how hard Google had pushed Chrome. So whether normal people are going to install something like this or not, I'm not convinced, really. I think that it's got a very small potential market of tech heads and, the kind of people that would listen to this show, maybe. But in terms of mainstream adoption, I'm not confident, I'm afraid.
I'd also ask whether their business model isn't very similar to, say, AdBlock, where you are paying, well, the advertisers are paying for the privilege of their adverts actually getting through the system. So much like AdBlock, is it not sort of fundamentally an extortion racket?
I think, yes, there's a link there. Certainly when I was reading the article, I thought about that as well. But they also allow you to sort of tick the things you're interested in, whereas I think with AdBlock, they just get paid to show, men's underwear or cars or IKEA, whereas maybe you would tick, I'm interested in sport and cars, and therefore you'd only get those two items.
But I think that the other fundamental problem with this is that it doesn't block adverts, does it? It might block the adverts that are supposed to be there and then put new ones there instead. But people don't want to see adverts, do they?
Yeah, that's a good point. I wouldn't know if a website was supposed to have an advert for item A, and they've decided to show me item B. It's still a bloody advert.
Yeah, and I make no apologies for the amount of advertising stories in this week's news, because it is, as you've just suggested, fundamental to our way of life at the moment, which is a really sad state of affairs. So let's move it on a bit and talk about Google's accelerated mobile pages, which we spoke about when it first became public last year. And this is partly Google's answer to Facebook's Instant Articles, which also launched in 2015. And both of these initiatives attempt to address the fact that bandwidth requirements and rendering speed of web pages on mobiles is really pretty atrocious, and it's getting worse. I mean, Google have said that about 40% of users will abandon any website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. But a huge number of pages out there take easily 3 times that long. Now, they've enrolled a lot of publishers and platforms already for this initiative, and it's going to be very widespread throughout the industry. But it will only support a subset of HTML with a few new tags added in. Only a small subset of CSS will be allowed. There'll be no developer-written or third-party JavaScript available, so only Google-approved JavaScript functionality will be supported. And all of that will be delivered through Google's content delivery network. There'll be no external style sheets and no inline styles, so you can see it's really quite restrictive. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're trying to get a fast web page to somebody, but the cynics amongst us would probably point out that there's really no need for Google to have done any of this at all, because even though it's an open source initiative, so was HTML2, and that was working fine for many, many years and fundamentally delivers exactly the same thing. But I guess that's really the point of the article I'm going to be linking to in the news, because this specific post is about advertising and how that's planned to work within accelerated mobile pages, and really implies, I tend to agree with it, that we're looking at Google trying to create a walled garden here, and it's really a walled garden that is aiming to encompass the entire mobile web.
But aren't we again going to look at this from the user's point of view? And I am exactly the same when I look at a web page and it's there for like 6 seconds and you've just seen sort of adverts pop up as the first thing that populates, or you start browsing a web page on your mobile device and you start reading it and the bit you're reading disappears because they've suddenly downloaded the next chunk of an image or the next thing, and it's just really frustrating. And so if there's a way for you to get it in the snap of an instant and it doesn't, carry on loading all the gumph, it would be a nicer experience. So from that point, from the end user point of view, it seems like a sensible way of doing it. And the fact that previous versions have failed, the way that HTML and things like this were able to do it or should be able to do it, but everyone's put on all these sort of trackers and JavaScript and, all these clever style sheets and things, it does need to just be stripped down for people to use the mobile. Isn't this, while it is a walled garden, you have to have a walled garden in order to get it to a point where people don't have the freedom to make it bloated. That's what you're doing. You're restricting their freedom to faff about and put nonsense, cruft on the page so that it is streamlined and can be cached and sent to your device.
Yeah, but don't you think this is down to the developers? I mean, there was a long time I wouldn't, for instance, read the Independent's website on my mobile phone, and the Guardian's website is still a little bit iffy, to be honest, even though they've had a big redesign. And it's by people boycotting sites that don't actually prove to be responsive to the end user that we'll see change, and we'll see a lot of this design-centric nonsense start to go away again. And all this initiative is doing is putting a lot of power in Google's hands, because they're going to be serving all this content. They're going to be controlling all the advertising in this content. And as I say, it fundamentally is going to be a mobile world that is controlled by Google at the end of the day. And I find that a little concerning. Whereas the alternative to deal with the issue, which you flagged up and is a genuine issue, is just to ignore sites and make the developers develop in a sensible manner.
But if you're a developer who wants to get on board with this Google caching, you have to, as I said, you have to strip out your website so that it can pass the Google acceptance filter, and therefore they bring it into their little area and they start caching it and serving it, a stripped down version of it. Wouldn't that send an alarm bell to that developer that, hang on a minute, we're having to go through this process in order to deliver the page via Google's caching system, this AMP. We should actually, like you say, it would flag it up to them that maybe something isn't right with their web page in the first place if they're having to go through these hoops without people boycotting it. Because The Verge is the one that I always use. When we do come onto our web browser review later, The Verge is the page that I go to test speed of loading, because it is just full of pictures and videos and nonsense that just annoys me. I like the technology sections they have, but the website is hideous. And I just think they must live in a world that has, fiber to the PC, because they don't seem to realize that on sensible, normal connections, it's a pain. And so if you are developing for the mobile web and you're thinking, right, I need to get onto this AMP thing, this accelerated mobile pages, I should maybe look at my web page in a different light.
Yeah, I guess you're right. If it raises awareness, then that can certainly be no bad thing at all. Of course, the big problem here that we've mentioned a couple of times is that a huge chunk of this is being driven by the advertising industry and actually getting eyeballs on adverts.
Well, at least Google's fighting the bad adverts, eh? At least according to their blog. They've cracked down on basically hundreds of thousands of dodgy adverts and publishers, and they claim that it's an ongoing effort with huge teams of people and bots working on this to eliminate these dodgy adverts of phishing scams and weight loss scams and counterfeit goods and stuff. So at least they claim that the adverts are supposed to be, bona fide. But I mean, I wouldn't know because I never see any because I block them on every device.
Yeah, I don't know whether I should have been or not. I was just shocked by the numbers in this, not only for the number of adverts that they actually remove, but the fact that they say they've got a global team of over 1,000 people dedicated to actually dealing with this problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's into the millions of dollars of salaries just to deal with this aspect of it. So the scale of it is pretty enormous. I mean, the scale of how much money they must be making is just mind-boggling.
I suppose given their revenue model is based on advertising, if you've got, let's say, dirty advertising, your whole revenue model starts to get undermined and leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. They want to have, pertinent or useful or at least valid and correct adverts rather than ones, like you say, phishing scams and fraudulent goods and things like this. So it's in their own interest to keep the quality of advertising and the quantity of advertising up, isn't it? But I mean, on the topic of the cost of these things, there's an article we've got here about the bot fraud. And so it's how the advertising industry is poised in 2015. They lost a combined $2.7 billion due to bogus and fraudulent bots clicking on their adverts and the advertiser having to pay when human eyes aren't actually seeing those adverts. And there's a quote in here that I am unclear about, and I'm hoping that one of you two can explain how these people are getting money, because the quote is this: bot fraud, essentially non-human internet traffic, occurs when operators are able to trick advertisers' detection systems into registering an impression. Masquerading as a legitimate user, the fraud passes through the advertising ecosystem, but often, it's the bot operators, not the advertisers, who collect payments for fake clicks. And I wonder, how is it that a bot is getting paid to click on an advert? Why aren't I getting paid to click on an advert? Why haven't I made a bot that gets me money just by scouring the web and clicking stuff?
Well, because it's illegal, first of all, because it's fraud. But how it works is you publish a website with content on it and you get some adverts on there, and then you build a bot that goes and clicks on those adverts and tricks the advertising agency, Google or whoever, into thinking that traffic is real, and then you coin in all the click money. And it's not much per click, but if you've got a sophisticated network of bots doing it, then you can actually make a living from it. But as I say, I don't advise it, as it's got to be illegal, hasn't it?
Right, I see. So you're hosting your own page and putting their adverts on it and then clicking on it yourself and paying yourself that way. Right, gotcha. Yeah. And this article explains that $7.2 billion of advertising revenue is lost or wasted through this fraud. And also that of the adverts that no one ever sees, either on websites that aren't, online anymore, or maybe hidden away in the dark corners of the web and things, advertisers waste $10 million a year on those adverts that are never seen. And the thing is, all these numbers, I just don't really care. I mean, the people have the money to spend on advertising. They're trying their best to get people to click on them, and they clearly have this money. These are big companies like Tag Heuer and Toyota and what have you. They can spend the money. They can lose it. I can't shed a tear over this, I'm afraid.
What about the small businesses who have got a very limited advertising budget and they think, oh yeah, online, that's a good way to do it. And so they pay a couple of grand or whatever to get their adverts around, hoping to see some return on that. And then all the clicks that they actually get and pay for are just bot clicks that go to some dodgy person in Eastern Europe or China or something. And they end up getting no benefit from it. And they've just wasted a couple of grand, which they can't really afford.
Because when you're that close to the money line, you'd be a lot more careful as to where you're putting your adverts. If we wanted to advertise, we might put an advert on DistroWatch, for example, knowing that people who are going there are keen on Linux. Whereas I think if you're, Argos or Asda's or something, you'd say, right, we need to be on X thousand websites. They'd go to a third party who would send it out to a third party who would send it out to a subcontractor who would eventually put it on a website, and they're just ticking how many websites they've got it on. And it's a lot less carefully planned than someone who can't afford to lose that money, because they would have a lot more, they would want to be more in control of where their adverts are being seen. Maybe I have a rose-tinted view and a sort of slightly anti-massive corporate view, but there we go.
Yeah, well, the whole advertising ecosystem is pretty pernicious, and I think perhaps one day we'll come back to it and speak to someone about it. But moving on then, but sticking on the theme of fraud, another story that's a follow-up to something we've spoken about in a previous show is that of Kickstarter, and in particular their organisation of the crowdfunding campaign for Talking, who were supposedly producing a little drone, a very advanced little drone called the Xano. Now, this was a British company that raised $2.3 million from their crowdfunding effort, but spectacularly failed to deliver. So how did Kickstarter actually react to all the bad publicity this failure generated? I mean, did they refund any of their cut back to the project backers?
Nope, they just paid a journalist to write a fluff piece for them.
Yeah, spot on. That's exactly what they did. And whilst this journalist's conclusions weren't particularly damning, as Joe just suggested, they do at least echo some of what we speculated at the time. I mean, specifically that the company really didn't have the technical prowess to deliver this drone at all. But I agree with you, Joe, that the journalist went really lightly on Kickstarter themselves. I mean, he cleared the company of outright fraud and then gave Kickstarter a very gentle slap on the wrist, I think, who, as you said, actually funded the article in the first place.
But you mentioned it there. Why are Kickstarter not refunding their cut to the backers who backed this? It's just outrageous that they're doing this and that they make money from a project that never gets delivered to people. I just don't understand how Kickstarter can get away with it.
Well, they wrote the rules. So, I mean, they're in the golden position where all of the people who pay money, they take a cut of. And so they obviously agree with people backing things and think it's a very good idea that people back the various things on Kickstarter. But then once that money's in their coffers, no matter what happens to the project that you've backed, it can fly, it can fail. They've got their money and that's it. And there's no sort of repercussions on them. But even if they did refund the money to the backers, let's say everyone paid $100, then Kickstarter's cut is like 3% or something. So everyone would get $3 back. Like, that's not really much use. Well, there's not a lot to anyone.
Well, it's better than a poke in the eye. I'd rather have $3 than no dollars.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be a show of solidarity, not a very good show, but at least it would show that Kickstarter don't make any money out of people that flop, and they're not just holding all the money, which they currently are. At least it would, show goodwill, let's say.
Yeah, but they're not going to do it for this one, because then they'd have to do it for every project that doesn't deliver, and that would set a very dangerous precedent, and then they'd actually have to, vet people more closely and make sure that projects weren't going to fail and that they were actually going to deliver. And I suppose that means that the whole crowdfunding model breaks down, doesn't it? There's an inherent risk involved in it, at least for the punters, and Kickstarter are not willing to take that risk. So it is what it is, I suppose.
Yeah, sadly it is. And I mean, that was something that the guy also picked up on, was the fact that these crowdfunding sites don't actually look like gambling sites, if you like. And it's something we've spoken about before. He specifically pointed out that they do look like shops and people expect goods to be delivered when they're paid for.
Well, let's move on to some actual Linuxy stuff for a change. And that is Snapcraft 1.0 is now available. So what is Snapcraft? Well, it's a build and packaging tool which helps you package your software as a snap. And snap packages, of course, are the new way Ubuntu is doing things. So this is starting to look dangerously like Jesse's prediction might come true, I think.
Hooray! Because I saw in the news this fortnight as well that Ubuntu, there's rumours they're going to release a convergent tablet at Mobile World Congress. So I was heartbroken to see that they were moving towards releasing that, and that was going against my prediction. So at least it's win one, lose one, or potentially win one, lose one at the moment.
Well, we're not supposed to talk about that tablet because it hasn't officially been announced yet, but man, I've been running Ubuntu Touch, the dev channel, on my Nexus 7 this last week. And apart from Sudoku, which is pretty addictive, it's a little bit ropey, I think. If they've really got this tablet coming out soon, they'd better do some serious development work, or they better have some serious development work that they haven't released yet. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit of a flop, this tablet that they're going to release.
So you've got a crook in your neck.
You mean from it not rotating properly and being in portrait mode?
Yeah, I saw you posting on Google Plus, and it doesn't look awfully clever, to be honest.
Well, you can fire up a terminal and remount the file system read-write and sudo nano the relevant config file and then reboot it, and then it rotates as you want. But I don't suppose the average person buying a tablet from a shop is going to be capable of doing that. But we've dragged it away from Snappy and Snaps and Snapcraft. This tool makes it relatively easy to package your software so that it'll actually work on Snappy Core and, this new version of Ubuntu that's coming. But the question is, are people actually going to use it?
Yeah, I think they've had to make it as easy as possible with as few hurdles in the way for developers to be able to package this up in order to get things onto the snaps. And from what I can see, you just get all, you tell it where all the various source files are for everything that your package will require, all the dependencies and things, and it goes out and does a massive collection and gets it all into the right format, into the right file hierarchy and things, and packages it as a snap. So they've tried to automate it as much as possible to reduce the problem of packaging, which is, an ongoing problem in the Linux ecosystem. But in more Ubuntu news, AT&T and Canonical have announced that they're partnering up to move a lot of AT&T's infrastructure, both internal and external, public-facing, over to the Ubuntu operating system for the networking, cloud, and enterprise applications. So it follows AT&T's goal from 2013 to move away from proprietary hardware and software, with the idea that it would be less expensive to maintain it if it's on the cloud, and also allow for sort of faster development and innovation, so they can move and spin up servers and things more quickly rather than having to do it all in-house and with proprietary software. So it clearly shows that Ubuntu is being one of the major sort of cloud infrastructures for these big companies. AT&T is not in the UK unless they operate under a different name, but I know they're huge in America. You always hear people talking about them, so it's clearly a big win for Canonical.
Well, we spoke about this on Mintcast, and I brought up the point, or the question at least, that is somewhat mentioned in the article that we'll link to. And that is, what about the Ubuntu phone, and where does that fit into this deal? Could it be that Canonical are going to get a phone released with a carrier, as most people buy their phone? Well, they don't buy their phone, do they? They get it on hire purchase, basically, by paying a massive amount every month for their service, and they slowly pay for the phone over the 24-month contract or whatever. And so could it be that Canonical are doing this deal with AT&T to cross over into the mainstream and actually get the Ubuntu phone into real people's hands in America?
I thought the stumbling block for Ubuntu phones in America was to do with the bans and things that they use in America, and a lot of the red tape, rather than people not wanting to actually sell it or to have it in their stores and on their services. But it's more sort of government red tape and having to jump through various hoops and things like this. But I guess even if that is the case, having one of the major telecom people, if that's what they call them, on board and helping you out has got to ease it and maybe put some pressure on the government to allow them to release Ubuntu phones. Maybe they could find ways that they've previously got new phones into the market. It can only oil the wheels, can't it?
Oh, well, either way, it's definitely one to watch, because if we do see an Ubuntu phone come out on AT&T, then that is a major step forward for Canonical, and it could potentially bring in a lot of money that they could then spend developing it further, and it might actually make it usable. You never know.
Yeah, it does mean we'll lose that smug look when everyone talks about Ubuntu phones and the Americans not being able to use them.
Yeah.
But anyway, the next news article is just a short sort of update for the listeners. So this is regarding Chromixium, which is Ubuntu with a sort of Chrome type look over the top. So the Chrome interface for standard laptops and things. And they've been contacted by Google saying that the Chromixium name is a little bit too close to Chrome and Chromium, and there's the possibility that users would be maybe wouldn't see the definition between something which is supported wholeheartedly by Google and something which is independent, and they don't like the idea that people might think it has the full backing of Google and therefore the full security updates and things. And so they've basically told them to change their name. So rather than fighting Google and getting into a difficult court battle about Chromixium versus any other name and things, the project decided, probably quite sensibly, just to rename. So they've taken Chromium and Ubuntu, taking the first letters of those, and has rebranded it as Cub. So Chromixium is now Cub.
Cub Linux, yeah. It feels very much like Google have kind of gone over to their place and gone, this is a nice distro we've got here. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. Because reading the communications that have gone on there. They've been very friendly, haven't they, Google? They've very friendly way. They've said, it's not, maybe would be a good idea if you change your name because, it's kind of infringing on us. And that QupZilla, the devs there said, yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, we'll change it. Whereas if they hadn't, it would have been, serious business and it would have been sued to oblivion. So I think it was a very sensible idea to not try and fight them. And I mean, realistically, Chromium, it's very similar. I mean, it might have the X in it of the kind of Linux, the Unix, all that stuff. But I think that it's a fair cop, really. It was too similar, and they perhaps should have thought about it a bit more carefully in the first place. But it just goes to show that the power of Google, no one wants to take them on, especially not their legal department.
Yeah, to be honest, I was surprised it took them so long to get this far. Because if you think back to what the logo used to be like for QupZilla, it was sort of the Ubuntu circle of friends, but done in the Google Chromium colours. It looked very much like a Chromium logo. So I think that probably has as much to do with it as the actual name itself.
Well, funnily enough, I was listening to my first impression of it. I think, I can't remember what episode, 50-something, 58 maybe. And that was one of the things I remarked on. That I said, that's got to be infringing some sort of copyright. And, well, sure enough, it obviously was.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the logo, because actually it's one of the things that I think stands out. The new one is a sort of a blue circle with some sort of paw on it, a cub's paw, I guess. And I think it's a really smart logo. I don't want to,
you don't want to turn into Linux Outlaws where they used to talk about their logos.
Exactly, yeah. They always had the logo chat, and let's not go down there, but it is a nice, smart logo.
Yeah, somewhat reminiscent of Sabar, I thought, so perhaps we'll be getting a visit from them next.
Oh, yeah, just one more toe, yeah.
Anyway, let's move it on, and a story that might strike a chord with the dude's named Ben out there, and that's about Ansible, and version 2's just dropped. Now, Ansible's based on Python and is currently owned by Red Hat. I think it's probably fair to say that its strong point is that the deployment scripts it uses, which it styles playbooks, are written in a more declarative form than some of its competitors. There seems to be quite a lot new in this release, but it looks as though one of the key areas of focus has been improved support for Windows and also platforms like OpenStack.
So just for the listeners here who don't know what Ansible is.
Yeah, not us at all.
Yeah, because I'm totally clued up on it. What exactly is Ansible in a tweet, say?
It's a software configuration and deployment platform. It allows you to write. I mean, you've come across things like Puppet and Chef, I guess, and maybe Salt.
Yeah.
Those sort of things. They all approach it in a slightly different way, but they're basically mechanisms for deploying software and managing it. So you can write little scripts to explain how the software is supposed to be delivered and in what format and what have you, with dependencies and all the rest of it. And as I mentioned, Ansible has always had a declarative style, uses YAML. But really, it's just a way of automating DevOps.
So deploying multiple servers in a data center, for example?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so this ties in with OpenStack, which it seems is doing very well. It's being adopted by a lot of businesses. But there are a few complications to get it working. And a lot of companies are struggling to get personnel who are trained sufficiently with OpenStack and actually know what they're doing with it.
Yeah, the link we'll put to is from a bit of PR, really, that came out of SUSE. And I thought it was interesting for the reasons you've just mentioned, Joe, and it sort of flags up some issues that are broader within the computing industry. So, for instance, the high degree of difficulty that you mentioned there, where there are actual reports saying that half of all enterprises that have tried to deploy OpenStack have failed. I mean, that is just an indication that it is too complex a software stack to be dealing with. And another thing they mention in this report is vendor lock-in concerns. And a lot of people worrying about this. I mean, this is supposed to be an open platform, and we've mentioned on the show previously that's not the case. I mean, the basics are open, but it's all the goodies that are bolted on top by various companies that provide the actual value there. And I'm sure I've referenced a post from Gartner before, and I went and dug it out before we started recording this afternoon, and the final paragraph of that was, It is critical to note that no vendor I've ever spoken to thinks that OpenStack interoperability means that it should be able to easily switch between distributions or OpenStack-based service providers. Rather, the desire is to ensure there's enough of an interoperability construct that there can be a viable OpenStack ecosystem. It's about the ability of ecosystem vendors to interoperate with a variety of OpenStack-based vendors, far more so than it is about the user's ability to interoperate between OpenStack-based solutions. And I think that is as true today as it was when that was written back in 2014.
So all this time that we talk about Apple locking you in and Microsoft making it difficult to jump out of their walled garden and things like this, it's as bad in the open source world because people want you to stay in their pocket and keep on paying them, don't they? It makes sense from a business point of view, but it does sort of go against what we always say is the ethos of being able to have your data and move it around and have choice and freedom of choice.
I think that's certainly the case in the enterprise space, yeah, very much so.
Do you think that it's really and truly necessary to have things as complicated as OpenStack going on in the enterprise? Have things like this evolved to fill a need, or have they just been developed for the sake of it and then the companies have been sold the idea that they need them?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is a need out there. Companies need to flog stuff.
So the latter then is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, well, in fairness, I'm being a little bit glib, to be honest, because there's obviously a need there for some standardized platform, because otherwise you're just reinventing the wheel constantly. But the bottom line is that the value really here for these sort of platforms is where there is vendor-specific functionality added on top or systems integrator functionality added on top, and that does promote the lock-in you're talking about.
Well, sticking with the sort of enterprise world and some of the deployments that they have, there's an announcement that Docker has purchased Unikernel Systems, which is a company based here in the UK. And the idea of this is that with a unikernel, you can sort of get rid of the operating system, as I understand it, and you just have the various parts of the operating system which are required stuck into the application which needs it. So in this case, you could have a container effectively sitting on top of only the parts of the operating system that are required to interface with the computer, the container on top, which obviously for these people would be Docker, and then whatever it is you want in that container running. So you end up with almost, as I see it, a single stack which is as slimline as you can possibly get without having to have a full operating system paring down to containing a Docker, paring down to having the application inside it. You just get everything in one pile straight on top of the hardware.
Yeah, it's interesting you said there about having the operating system compiled into the application, because that's one way of looking at it. And the alternative way, of course, is that it's the application being compiled into the kernel. And you might say it's semantics, but it seems to take on quite a lot of importance certainly from a debugging point of view and a variety of other things. So apart from the story that you've just been speaking about, Jesse, in the show notes, I'll also be putting in one from Brian Cantrell, who works at Joyent, who obviously has a slightly different take on things considering what line of business they're in.
Well, it seems like a reasonable idea to me to slim it down to the absolute bare minimum. If you don't need certain aspects of an operating system, certain applications, why bother having them? It's just a waste of resources, isn't it? A waste of disk space, a waste of RAM, and waste of code. So if you can literally just have the absolute bare minimum that you need to get your application running, then that strikes me as quite sensible.
Yeah, building on your point about having less code, if there is less code, you have fewer attack surfaces. And I know that I'm chatting to a guy at a Linux meetup actually about how he has various scripts which will, spin up a server, allow you to install the operating system, and then put the container on top, and then put bum. There are all these stages which need to happen. If you're able to do a sort of a single deployment which installs both the operating system and Docker and the application within Docker that you want, it simplifies and speeds up the process of having more instances spun up of, as and when you need them to meet demand or to meet your expanding system or what have you.
Yeah, and unikernel work is becoming sort of flavour of the month as well, with the expanding reach of the Internet of Things and very low-powered and low hardware spec devices out there.
Yeah, it seems like a good fit for very small Internet of Things devices. why bother having loads of cruft when all you need it to do is one very simple job, like log temperature or whatever? Surely this kind of unikernel approach would be perfect for that.
Well, let's shuffle along a little bit and talk about the drama of the week. There always seems to be one in the Linux world, and this time around, it's our old friend Matthew Garrett, sometime coder and full-time and self-described social justice warrior. He recently noticed that the Linux Foundation had changed its bylaws to no longer allow individual foundation members to elect board members. Now, Garrett wrote, "The majority of the board is chosen by the member companies, 10 by platinum members, which costs you $500,000 a year to become one, 3 by gold members, which is $100,000 a year, and 1 by silver members, which cost between $5,000 and $20,000 a year, depending upon the company size. Up until recently, individual members who paid just $99 a year could also elect 2 board members, allowing for community perspectives to be represented at the board level." Now, Garrett speculated this change had been made because Karen Sandler, sometime attorney and full-time social justice warrior, wished to stand for election to the board. Now, Karen is currently Executive Director of the Software Freedom Conservancy. And if you remember what we've talked about on previous shows, you'll recall that Conservancy is currently pursuing a lawsuit against VMware for alleged GPL violations, and also that VMware is a silver member of the Linux Foundation. So obviously there was a huge amount of social media stink about this, but the party line became pretty obvious very quickly when the ever-pliant Greg Cage was wheeled out onto Reddit to state, in part, that this change merely brought the Linux Foundation in line with common practice in other similar organisations. And a little while later, Jim Zemlin, the Executive Director of the Linux Foundation, popped up with his own blog post that echoed this view, but also did something that I thought was cynical even by his own Sith-like standards. With Sandler appearing to many to be the injured party, and that injury being directly caused by the organisation he heads up, Zemlin didn't really address the main issue, but instead used his piece to chastise those who had voiced doubts about Sandler's fitness for the post online.
Well, we've spoken about it quite a lot, haven't we? The fact that the Linux Foundation is a trade body and is all about the people and the companies giving it money, and it's there to represent their interests. So it's not a huge surprise, is it, that they're not that interested in community? Because having people whose interests conflict with the companies like VMware on the board, it just doesn't make sense, does it? So of course they're going to change the rules to avoid it. But I suppose they should probably be a bit more honest about it rather than trying to whitewash it and basically lie about it.
Yeah, I hold no love for any of the people involved in this or the organisations. But what struck me as being particularly cynical, I think, and was what I mentioned, that Jim Zemlin, rather than directly addressing the question on the table, tried to deflect matters away by sort of saying to everyone, "Oh, be nice to Karen," when it's his organisation that wasn't being nice to Karen in the first place. But I guess the other point I wanted to sort of think about a little bit and to talk around was actual community representation, because when you've got people like Karen, who is very strident in her views on certain topics, I mean, she is representative of a small portion of the community. I mean, the wider Linux using community obviously is made up of all sorts of different folks, and it's very hard to find representatives, if you like it is when you're electing a politician. Invariably, they don't represent their constituency in its entirety. So are we in a position where we are always going to be struggling to actually get fair representation on bodies like the Linux Foundation, simply because half a dozen people, say, cannot represent the diverse views actually out in the wider community?
Yeah, you've set your question out very well, but also I feel answered it, because you can't. If there are 10 views to be had on a topic and you've only got 6 people, even with the best averaging in the world, you can only get a certain proportion of the various views. And fundamentally, there are generally 2 or 3 sides to any one topic, so those people may well coalesce around one view, and then you end up with 1 or 2 of the opposing views not represented. You also have a problem in most communities where people will promote or maybe bring in people that they are friends with or who have similar views, and that's where you end up with, lots and lots of middle-aged white men in one particular company, and maybe a lot of older black women in another company, because they share the ideals with people who are similar to them, and they feel comfortable around them. So you may end up actually with people having the same views, even if you have a diverse range, because they've been selected or nominated by people who, have those views, and you end up sort of going down the same rabbit hole. But yeah, you would have to have a very large number of people on any one board to get a full range of all of the various opinions and thoughts for all the topics that the Linux Foundation covers. So I don't think you're going to get a way in which you can have a full representation, and just because one person on there has very strong views in one way, swapping them out doesn't mean you're going to get, I don't want to say better because it implies you agree or disagree with their views, but what I'm saying is you would get a very different way in which the Linux Foundation is focused. I think you just have to sort of hope that over time things churn, and that gets you your wider, flatter base of opinions.
Well, something tells me we're going to be hearing a bit more about this going forward. I don't think this has been put to bed somehow. It's going to rumble on. But let's move it on. And yet more bad news regarding the BBC microbit, which is a mini computer, kind of a little bit like the Raspberry Pi, but much more limited and fairly cheap. And it was supposed to be originally, wasn't it for the beginning of this term that's now, so last September, it was supposed to be in the hands of every 12-year-old kid, and that has slipped, and now it's slipped again, and who knows? I mean, I have stopped believing it now. I don't think there's any point even listening to the predicted date, the estimated date that kids are going to get them. I know some prototypes have been delivered and some teachers are checking them out and playing with them, but in terms of this mass rollout that all the kids are going to get, it just doesn't seem to be happening. And especially in the face of the Raspberry Pi Zero, it just seems to be less and less relevant. When it was announced, it seemed really cool, but now time's ticked on, and perhaps they shouldn't have spoken about it before they could actually deliver.
I would take disagreement, if you can do that, with your representation of it versus the Raspberry Pi Zero on a number of grounds. Firstly, there is a lot more functionality. I know we've talked about this, but it's got buttons on it, for example, built into the board, and it's got much easier like connectors for it to go into a parent board and things like this on the BBC Micro. Also, the cost. I know the Raspberry Pi Zero is cheap, but this will be given out for free, and I know that someone is paying for it, and that is us. But ultimately, the children who wouldn't go out and buy a Raspberry Pi or don't know what it is are being given this, and they might open their eyes to something that their parents aren't introducing them to. So I'm sure that of all the children who are interested in Raspberry Pis, and we hold up as examples of coding and kids being interested in computers, 70-80% of them must have technologically minded or interested parents introducing them to it and explaining how you code in Python or Scratch or what have you. And finally, I looked at buying a Raspberry Pi Zero the other day. I couldn't find one for love nor money. So the idea that this is being delayed, why don't you get a Raspberry Pi Zero, isn't currently true. Now, obviously, let's hope their manufacturing speeds up and they can get them out into the hands of people who want them. But at the moment, I think the Raspberry Pi Zero is as delayed as the BBC Micro.
Well, it's all well and good for me to say that because a very kind listener of the Pi podcast sent me one. So I've actually got one at last. But you're right, it is very tricky to get hold of one. And they're going to start making them in Wales, or I think they have started making them in Wales. So they're going to be available fairly soon. But yeah, you're right, you can't get one right now. So it is effectively delayed.
So, I mean, sticking on the Raspberry Pi and microcomputer sort of topic, listeners in the UK almost definitely will have heard of Robot Wars. And I think there was an American version. I mean, it's one of those things that I think either we imported from somewhere else or we exported, and there's an Australian version, an American, and off we go. But it's basically there's a number of house robots and a number of challenges which come in, and so friends or family or super nerds get together and build a robot, and they go into a ring in the middle of the stadium and they fight, and then you go through various kind of knockout rounds and things like this, and one of them is the winner. And it was very, very popular, and the house robots had fire and axes and all sorts of things, and every person who came along with their challenger had various unique features, and it was always a gamble as to whether or not it would even work and whether it was fast enough or powerful enough and all these sorts of things. And it stopped maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago, and it turns out that the BBC are giving it a reboot, so it's going to be coming back out again. They're going to change up a few things and make it a bit more interesting for the younger audience, and having caught up with the technology, that technology largely being the use of Raspberry Pis in robots and the sort of rebirth of an interest in the sort of hackery kind of maker space. So I think with Raspberry Pis, with improvements in tiny robotics, and with 3D printing, the scene has been set for a new raft of people to come along and have a go at Robot Wars.
Yeah, and for my money anyway, this sort of initiative is something that's going to get kids interested in technology and these little devices far more than the classroom programming.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was watching it as a kid, I wanted to build them, but I don't think I knew how I would have started. And even if I did, it would have been, the hurdles are there to get into it. But now with the Raspberry Pi and other things like the Beagle Bone and Arduinos and things like this, there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of videos on YouTube just how to get basic objects moving around on wheels and programming them. And once you've got that down, all you're then doing is working out how you attach a chainsaw to it, and off you go.
Well, that'll do it for the main news, but before we move on, just a quick reminder that the Greater London Linux User Group, the GLUG, is having a meetup on the 28th of January, that's this Thursday as we release this, at the Mulberry Bush pub near Waterloo Station from about 6 p.m. onwards. So if you're in London, come along. Jesse and I are going, and it should be good fun. So let's move on and talk about ReactOS. Well, not content with being one of the top 10 UK Linux podcasts, I thought we'd try and strive to be the preeminent ReactOS podcast in the UK. So I suggested that we should look at it. And I'm sorry, chaps, basically. Sorry, I should have never suggested it. Because I couldn't get it to work, basically. I tried everything. And in the end had to resort to their pre-configured VirtualBox image. So what is ReactOS? Well, Paddy, you teased it at the top there. What it is a totally free and open source operating system that is not based on Linux. It's its own thing, and it aims to have binary compatibility with Win32. So you can, at least in theory, run all of your Windows applications on it, and it should be absolutely hunky-dory. Now, I have said previously, I'm not sure if it was on this show or Mintcast or whatever, that I quite like Windows 7 in terms of its interface and the way it works. What I don't like is the fact that it's proprietary and that it's a bit slow and rubbish and virus infested and that kind of thing. Well, ReactOS, at least in theory, could be the solution there. There are certain programs that I need, like my drum synthesizer thing that I hook my electric drum kit up to, and amp modelers and stuff, basically music making software that is not available for Linux. I'm sure there are probably alternatives, but I'm used to these ones. I know how they work. I'm not going to learn new stuff. So in theory, ReactOS would be brilliant because it would mean that I could run all of that stuff in a free and open source operating system. So I keep using this word in theory because in practice, it's not there, is it? I mean, they don't claim to be a stable release, so we can't really criticize it too much. But it's pretty hopeless trying to actually get it running on hardware, or at least for me. And I tried it on various different laptops. that, are fairly standard hardware, I thought, but no joy. Now, Paddy, you've got a ThinkPad. If it's going to work on anything, surely it's going to work on that.
Yeah, but this is my main box, and it is not going anywhere near my main box. I spanned it up in a virtual box a couple of times to make sure it worked, and it seemed absolutely fine. And I went through the install process a couple more times so that I understood that. And I was feeling comfortable enough with it that I actually installed it on my main work laptop, which isn't the ThinkPad. It's Sony Vaio I have to use at work because I need to use Windows. And I thought, okay, if it can replace Windows 10 and Ubuntu, which are the two OSs I use at work temporarily, do things like joining to domains and accessing network shares and printers and what have you, then it'll have proved itself. Now, sadly, the same install process that worked flawlessly in a virtual machine wiped out my partition table and trashed the whole hard disk. So last Sunday was spent reinstalling Windows 10 and Ubuntu and all my applications on my work laptop, as opposed to actually spending any time with ReactOS. And I must say that kind of soured things for me just a little bit.
But you had backups and stuff, so it wasn't a complete disaster. It was just the time of putting the laptop back together.
Yeah, it did take all day, in fairness. I mean, it's a good reminder, actually, of how bad Windows is at dealing with software distribution. And in fact, you have to download everything individually and muck around with it. Whereas in Ubuntu, I've got it all scripted, so I just run a script once I've got the base install done, and it goes away and fetches everything back for me. So it's a helpful reminder why Linux is better than Windows in certainly some cases.
Well, a lot of cases, I would say. But when I actually got ReactOS running in the virtual machine, in VirtualBox, it has a package manager of sorts, doesn't it? Which is quite cool.
Yeah, it's an application manager, and it's sort of an amalgamation between Ubuntu Software Center and Synaptic. And so it's got various topics that you can look at, whether it be multimedia or games or productivity and things. And then it shows you options of things you can install there, which is the only bit that I saw which I felt was consistent with the sort of Unix way of doing things, where like you say, you have a package manager and you can use that to search. Everything else, I just felt like I was in a very, very old version of Windows, which I know is what they're going for, but I just couldn't understand why we were looking at it.
Well, I showed my wife and she said, "Oh, that looks great. Yeah, it looks like old school Windows. Excellent. Can I get Photoshop running in it?" And, because that's what she needs Windows for. And potentially this could replace the Windows partition on our desktop machine, because that's pretty much all she needs it for. But it's just not to be, is it? It hasn't been developed enough. I just wish that it had more development. I mean, I know, Jesse, you live in a Windows-free world, apart from at work, don't you? So you have no interest really in this kind of thing. But I know, Paddy, you kind of have to use Windows at work and, tinker with Windows a bit at home as well, don't you? So can you see, at least in theory, this being a replacement for that?
That's such an unfair question, because I could see it happening if it actually worked and supported all the same functionality. I mean, in a virtual box, I was reasonably happy with it, to be honest. I mean, it's got the software center thing that you mentioned, the applications manager, whatever it was called, and applications that are downloaded from online, just EXEs of a few things that I've typically run on Windows previously, downloaded fine, installed fine. But there were some right oddities. I mean, Internet Explorer's included, but it's running in Wine. I didn't really understand that, since this is supposed to be binary compatible.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Wine there. I thought that you wouldn't need it, because the whole distro is effectively doing the job of Wine.
Yeah, but to try and give you a straight answer to your question, I think I could see a place for it if it all worked. I mean, it has a nice familiar interface, and it's an interface that we're forever praising on this show, and like when Linux distros follow it to some extent. It's nice and clean. It didn't come with a lot of superfluous applications, which is also a curse with a lot of Linux distributions these days. And it was also very light. I mean, the actual ISO you downloaded, I can't remember how big that was, but as far as I can tell, it was only a few hundred megabytes.
Yeah, only a couple of hundred, I think. Yeah, very small, certainly compared to even something like Ubuntu, which feels just bloated compared to ReactOS.
Yeah, and even within a VM, it was a snappy environment to work in, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised when getting around to installing it, so I was a little bit slow on the uptake to investigate this one, and having heard your two woes of USBs and destroying laptops and partitions and things, I thought I'd have a look at the VM first, and it was as simple as downloading their pre-installed VM and off we go. And then kind of was persuaded that I should maybe look at it a bit more detailed. Got a USB stick, failed, and so dug out a DVD from the drawer, which I have to say, it occurred to me actually how rarely I now burn DVDs and things, and downloaded the ISO and put the DVD in, and could barely see the little bar that shows you how much of the DVD is taken up by the thing you're about to install. I was like, oh, this is a CD. So swapped out the DVD for a CD, even though I have thousands of both. I'm not going to waste a DVD. And even then it was only like a quarter or a third of a CD. I mean, it's absolutely tiny. And so the install was very quick. And one of the features, we've mentioned why, and I just wanted to point it out in the install, is that they credit a number of projects that they are either using, well, obviously that they're using, and they just wanted to sort of show their thanks, which I thought was quite a nice feature. You don't see it very often, to say, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. There are contributors that we're using the fact that it's open source, and here's our praise to them, which I thought was quite good. So I did eventually, using the CD, get it installed onto some actual hardware, and like you say, it just wiped the box. I mean, there wasn't anything on it that I particularly needed, and it had to wipe it into FAT, so that was the only option, and off it went. But yeah, once it was installed, it was on a fairly old, in fact, your old laptop, Joe, that you lent me, and it was fairly quick. I was surprised that when I installed Firefox, because I couldn't actually find Internet Explorer in the menu, but I installed Firefox using their application manager. It was okay, but it was very crashy. I was something that's come from their application manager, you'd expect to have been tested and worked well, but it didn't really. I mean, there were 3 different versions of Firefox to install, so I picked the latest one, obviously, and it didn't seem to work very well, so I wasn't that impressed with it. And I then went scouring the internet for executables, and it was like a trip down memory lane. I went to CNET, and they have download.com. I thought, I used to go on here quite a lot and look at all these things, and it just brought home to me how removed I am from Windows, because despite the fact that I see it 5 days a week, because I'm in a business environment, I don't get access to anything. I don't get any kind of privileges or rights. If I want to install something, it has to be on the official install list, and they have to approve it, and it all gets done. I mean, actually, at the moment, we're working on thin clients, and so there's a server somewhere in Birmingham doing the actual hard work. And so I am dumbed when I use Windows because I can't get anything. And so it is just an application. We use it, and off we go. And so actually to install things and get EXEs and try and work out why the network isn't working, or how do I get the wireless working, I was a little bit flummoxed in a number of places, I've got to say.
Well, we talked about how small the ISO is, and that has got to be because of the lack of hardware support. I mean, you were very lucky by the sounds of things, Jesse, to get it actually even booting on that old Dell that I gave you. I like that you said lent me. That's good. Maybe I'll get it back one day.
I think in the back of my head, I know it might be recalled at any moment.
You never know. Even though it's got an IDE hard drive, that's how old that is. But I tried it on everything, and my projector, my test laptop, my proper laptops. I didn't try it on the desktop because that's a bit sacred, and a bit like your ThinkPad, Paddy. It's you just don't want to take the risk, even live. But I just couldn't get it working. So it's a shame, because I remember trying it years ago, and it worked for me on whatever. Maybe it was that one of yours, Jesse, possibly, or maybe the one that I gave you, Paddy. The Vio. But anyway, I have tried it before on hardware and found it to be all right, but just very crashy. And I tried to install Pro Tools on it, and that just blue screened immediately. So in terms of an actual usable product or project or whatever you want to call it, it's nowhere near there. But in terms of the goal of it, I don't know, do we think it's an admirable goal, or should they just give up and just leave Windows to be Windows and have all the other free operating systems to be free?
I guess in a way you're asking a question that RMS would phrase in a slightly different way, which would be, by using this, are you actually helping perpetuate things like Windows? Because there's no reason for people to use alternatives whilst there is a free, in air quotes, version of Windows out there.
Well, surely RMS would have no problem with people running ReactOS and running free software on top of that, like Firefox, for example.
Love to ask him the question, because I think his gut reaction would be completely different from his logical reaction to that.
Yeah. But, well, you didn't answer my question, though. I mean, what do you think about it?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable approach, to be honest, because Microsoft keep changing things, and generally not for the better. And for those of us who do have to run or choose to run Windows applications, I'm thinking primarily of gamers, which I don't count myself amongst, it'd be good to have the choice there to be able to use free and open source software. But that also is kind of the downfall here. Because Microsoft are changing things, it means application interfaces do get updated. I mean, they're very good about backwards compatibility, but it doesn't mean new things aren't added all the time that newer software takes advantage of. And the big Achilles heel, as you've pointed out, is hardware support, because the hardware manufacturers are forever throwing out new things, and to actually get that hardware support there, I mean, it took Linux a long time to get to a stable position. And for a small project like ReactOS, I can never see them supporting much other than a very small subset.
Before I answer your question, Joe, can I just ask a couple of questions to clear things up? So it looks like it's from the 1980s, early 90s. Fine, that's just a GUI kind of thing. If it had hardware support for a modern laptop, let's say one of a Dell, or like you say a ThinkPad, which has got fairly mainstream kind of components, and it worked seamlessly with all of those components, would you be able to install brand new things on it, like the latest Photoshop was your example, Joe? Or, I mean, for games to run, you have to have DirectX 10. Are we on 11 now? I forget where we are. But you need to have those very, very new things. And would they be able to be installed on this?
Well, you're asking a lot of hypotheticals there. You're basically saying, if this worked properly, would you be able to install those? Well, if it was developed sufficiently, then I would have thought, yes, given enough money thrown at it and developer time, then hopefully, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. If that could be a possibility, so you could run the latest Windows software on there, would people use it? I know I would, certainly. If it worked as well as Windows 7, then of course I would, because it's free and open source software. And so I would like to see that development happen. But the development has been very slow on this, because it seems that not many people are that interested in it.
Yeah, I guess my question was, if it works perfectly, would it work perfectly? Yeah. But I guess I'm not a particularly good person to answer this, because as you say, I don't have anything that I need Windows for. And so I happily, I was kind of confused as to why we're looking at it, because it's so different to what I'm currently used to. But I fully see, if you have one particular application and you reluctantly have Windows, if you find that you can install it on some hardware and you can actually say, hand on heart, I don't run proprietary operating systems, that would be the only benefit I can see.
Well, let's not spend too long talking about it. I suppose let's wrap it up there. But in conclusion, for me, I would say that it's nowhere near production ready, but they don't claim that. But I would really love to see more development on it. And you never know, one day I might be able to use it instead of Windows. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our existing monthly supporters. It's very much appreciated, and helps us keep the lights on and servers going, and occasionally lets us buy things for the show. So thanks a lot, guys. And it's also worth mentioning that we've got merch available on the website. If you go to linuxluddites.com/shop, you'll see we've got t-shirts, long sleeves, hoodies, lanyards, and a mug, which Jezra bought one of, obviously, because it appears in his SipClick, his coffee a day thing on a regular basis. So that's pretty cool to see on Google+. So go and check it out. There's all sorts of stuff there. There's women's t-shirts, and you can display your fandom with pride at various conferences and stuff.
Yeah, despite our wanting to limit the colours to be sort of black and white in keeping with the show, you can't do that on Spreadshirt. So actually you can have any colour with Linux Luddites and our slogan on the back. So you can show your choice of colour.
And it also says contact details. So show@linuxluddites.com if you want to email us, or we're on Twitter and Google Plus and Facebook, or you can leave a comment on the website.
Yeah, we should start off this feedback section just by saying there was quite a lot of feedback on the website, and there was some toing and froing, some discussions on Dockers and containers and things, which were a bit too long and detailed to get into this feedback segment. But if you're interested and want to maybe know a little bit more and have some things explained, they're very good set of discussions on there. So I'd point you towards last show's show notes.
Yeah, 69 that was.
So we kick off with Dr. Fred Cheese, who says, "Gents, in this show, I heard a phrase that struck a chord with me. Just another distribution. I think that just another distribution is an affliction that Linux does suffer. In some ways, it's nice to have the variety of choice, in others not. To have a variety of choice of not quite finished products is a little disheartening. The reason Apple regained their popularity was having a complete package. I think that distros like the Mint family have the right idea and work well. A solid base with varying degrees of eye candy depending on your preference and choice of window manager. As a community, we need to take a breath and look at how we are seen from the outside. Currently, we're a clamour of voices lacking direction other than for the freedom and open source principles, which are also variable." And I suppose, in answer to that, you could maybe think of things like Elementary OS, which is trying to sort of have a single focus, a single look, so that it does have that sort of Apple-y type feel. I mean, that's probably coincidence because that's what maybe they're used to using or what they want to emulate. But whether you like the Apple look or not, it is one of the few distributions that has a very clear kind of design goal, whereas other ones are a bit more, as he points out here, a bit more sort of mishmashed and without a clear driver as to who their audience is and what their look is.
So the solution to having loads of different distros doing all different things is to have a new one that does it perfectly and is going to attract users from Windows and OS X. That's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, a unique idea like that would be great, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have enough standards, so we need a new standard. No, it's just this perpetual problem, isn't it? That you can't expect to have one distro. I mean, the closest really you've got to that is Ubuntu, but then you've also got Mint, and then you've got Fedora, and the list is endless, really. I don't think you're ever going to get one standard distro that everyone uses. It's just not how it works with open source, unfortunately. But Chris said, just as a side note to Paddy's prediction about someone dying as a result of a hack on an Internet of Things device, there was an incident in the US involving a Rolling Stone reporter by the name of Michael Hastings dying in a fishy accident a little over 2 years ago. There were many speculations that his car was hacked over some stories he'd written or was working on at the time. And I hadn't heard about that. That's quite worrying. And Florian also said that there was a guy suffering from brain damage because all his Bitcoin mining PCs overheated the room he was sleeping in, which isn't Internet of Things, but I suppose it's sort of tangentially related. That's a horrifying story.
Yeah, that's pretty gruesome. There were a couple of tweets about this as well. Just for clarity, my particular prediction was that someone would die as a result of a hack of an Internet of Things device, and I don't think these two stories qualify, but I can see it happening still, very sadly.
You never know. Hopefully not, but I fear you might be right.
Well, moving on to phones, Isaac Carter got in touch and said, "You can uninstall Cortana from the latest CyanogenMod update. I received the update on my OnePlus One, tried out Cortana for a couple of weeks, realised how bad it was, and then uninstalled it." And I guess Isaac's kind of referring back to what you were saying about your OnePlus One, and we were talking about Microsoft heavily getting involved in that ecosystem.
Yeah, I am not interested in anything that Microsoft have got to offer, and thankfully it's not in CyanogenMod, it's just in the proprietary CyanogenOS, so it doesn't really affect me. But good to know that you can uninstall it anyway.
Yeah, and Floyd Wallace also got in touch with a phone tip, and it was specifically to do with how to mount Windows phones under Linux. Now, we're not a Windows Phone podcast, but if you're interested in how to do this, then go and have a look at our website where Floyd explains all.
And we touched on the topics of our predictions from the last show, and Mandy Myers got in touch to say, I was surprised that in your prediction segment, Jesse's prediction didn't get a thumbs up, the one about a major security bug, when a few weeks before your show, the Grub 2 vulnerability was released. I didn't hear this on any Luddites episode, actually. Just press backspace like 24 times, was it? To get the subroot on any machine with physical proximity. Combine that with some other bug, or some part of Intel's remote access BIOS stuff, and you can even do this remotely, possibly. I think, in reply to Mandy, the prediction that I made was that there would be a major security bug within a social network, and that those would be released. So it would be a hack of the social network, and everyone's usernames and passwords and stuff would be released, or maybe more private information like the Maudley Harrison. What was that website with the cheating people?
Yeah, like you don't know what it is.
I don't need to cheat.
It's Ashley Madison.
Ashley Madison, thank you. So that was where I was coming from. But I mean, throughout the year, we've covered many security bugs or zero-day exploits and things like this, which happen all the time because not all code is all perfect. Even code that's been out in the wild for ages and years, you find there are security exploits and things like this. So it's going to go on. I think predicting that there will be a security bug in Linux is basically a given. There's going to be another Heartbleed or SSH problem, as there has been, if you've heard in the news the last couple of weeks. So thanks for trying to support me, but I think it's a slightly different twist on what I was predicting.
I think Mandy might be referring to my prediction that there'd be another shell shock or Heartbleed style bug, but we didn't acknowledge the Grub one because I don't think that was as big a bug, because you need physical access, and if you have physical access to a machine, then all bets are off anyway, pretty much. Although the possibility of combining it with another bug, maybe, but it wasn't up there with shell shock and Heartbleed, I'm afraid. And my attempts to spin stage fright as a win just fell on deaf ears, I'm afraid. But thanks anyway, Mandy.
Well, let's wrap up the feedback with another comment from Floyd Wallace. This time around, Floyd got in touch with regards to our conversation with Phelim Whiteley about running Android without Google Apps or services. And Floyd said, "Thanks for having Mr. Whiteley on the show. I think he missed his main point. He does not like depending on Google to have access to his data. I don't want my data in the cloud. I'm not afraid of the NSA or Google snooping around in my life. They'd be bored to tears. What I do fear is losing access to my data because of a court ruling that Google can't use my data in ways that make them money, causing the company to pull the plug on the service. Or even Google just changing focus and deciding to drop various services in favour of something else. They've done that frequently in the past, even with very popular products and services."
Yeah, I think this is a very pertinent point, and maybe we didn't sort of rally on it quite as strong as we should have done when Phelim was making it, because it is fair to say that Google has a past history of dropping things that they suddenly don't like or don't want to support or isn't flavour of the month or what have you. And if all your data is in there and you don't get time to pull it out, it could be a real problem. I mean, I used to use Dropbox an awful lot before Drive became more integrated into everything and you could edit things online, whereas I always had a problem with Dropbox that I would make text files without .txt at the end because you don't need it in Linux. And then when I came to try and edit it online, you had to download it and faff about, and Dropbox became a pain. So I moved over to Drive. And it suddenly occurred to me that if Dropbox, went out of business tomorrow, where would all my data go? It would just disappear. So it actually, struck a chord with me, and maybe I should have heard it from Phelim when he was actually discussing it on the show.
Yeah, it comes back to that same old point that we've made before, that open source software is very important, but open standards are arguably more important, because if you use open standards and the data isn't locked up in one particular format that is only accessible by a certain application, then you have the freedom to use whatever software you want with it, including open source software. And that seems to be his pragmatic approach to it. It's not necessarily just about software freedom. It's more about the freedom of the data that you're inputting and using and ultimately own.
But I remember Paddy did make the point on the show that requires, you having all your data on your own server does require quite a high level of technical nous, especially to make sure that you're keeping it secure and up to date, and you haven't inadvertently opened every port to the internet or left yourself a hole or something that someone can get into your network. And then you've got someone rooting around your network. On my firewall, you see hundreds and hundreds of attempts every day to just see what ports you have open and things. And if you're not absolutely up to speed on how you should be using these when they're facing the open web, you could actually probably do yourself more damage than allowing someone like Google to do it. Now, we come back to the very start of the point, because Google's holding your data, but it's whether or not you have the technical abilities to do that. And I think I'm on the crux of that, where I've very carefully and very methodically made sure that I have as little internet facing as possible, and I don't have web pages hosted and all that sort of thing. I just have an SSH tunnel. But it's a case of how clever do you need to be, and how do you know that you're clever enough to do it securely? I suppose that's the question, is unless you do some sort of course, or unless you have some way of knowing that you are capable of doing it in a secure way, you could, you might think you're knowledgeable enough. I might think I'm knowledgeable enough, and then get yourself in more trouble. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I know we touched on it, and certainly Paddy raised it when we talked to Phelim. So that's obviously something you need to think about when setting up your own servers.
It's also a question of how important your data is to you, I think, in fairness. I mean, for years I carted around Thunderbird mailboxes on a variety of devices, I mean, from CDs onwards, as I'd moved between computers, so I could actually have access to that data. It wasn't backed up in the cloud, because the cloud doesn't actually exist as it does now back in those days. But over time, I've come to realize there's less and less of my life that it really crippled me to lose that's online. So if I had no access to any computing devices at all, I could still live my life, apart from obviously some aspects of my working life, perfectly happily. It would inconvenience me. It upset me to lose photos of my daughter, for instance, and things like that. But it wouldn't be the end of the world. And I don't know whether that's just because I'm getting older and I'm seeing things in a little bit more perspective, or perhaps because less of my life is purely digital than some of the younger generations. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first thought that comes to mind is, what is more important than a photo of your daughter when she was young? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, what is it that you could protect more passionately than a photo of your children?
The actual living, breathing creature.
Oh, okay, right, okay, yeah. So if you're bringing real world stuff into it, then yes, of course, that's a stupid question. Your house you live in, all those sorts of things are more important than a picture, which is a nice memory. But if we're just talking about data, your MP3s, your photos, your accounts, maybe emails, a correspondence with famous people, whatever it might be, of the data you can possibly back up and have in multiple places and have on the cloud and have on you and whatever you might be able to do with it, surely the one that everyone cites as the most important is photographs.
Yeah, and for me, even emails, I'm a huge hoarder. I'm a hoarder in real life situations. I used to hoard old laptops until I palmed them off to you two and chucked away some of the more broken ones. But digital hoarding, I am a terrible, terrible offender, because why not? For the sake of a tiny little hard drive, you can hoard huge amounts of data. And to me, the idea of losing my emails, my emails go back to pretty much the start of Gmail, and that was like 10 years, no, more than 10 years ago. And the idea of losing them all horrifies me. But if Google were to suddenly go bust or shut down Gmail, as unlikely as that seems, then I'd lose all of my email. I did back them up at one stage, but that was several years ago, and I can't see myself doing it regularly like I should do. But you're right, Paddy. Ultimately, what would I really lose if I lost all my emails? Not much, really. But the thought still horrifies me because I'm a hoarder. But before we get too philosophical, I suppose we better wrap up the feedback and move on and talk about some browsers. We've talked a lot on this show about browsers and Chrome versus Firefox and how I'm still desperately clinging on to Firefox and haven't given in to Chrome, unlike you two who use a nice proprietary browser for everything. But we thought we'd look at some browsers that are lesser known, and we narrowed it down to QupZilla and Pale Moon. So Pale Moon we'll get back to, but let's start with QupZilla then. And this is a Qt-based browser, which, as far as I'm concerned, isn't hugely relevant to me because it didn't work with any Google services pretty much. So that was almost the end of that for me, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, let's start on a real positive, shall we then? Just parking that for a second. This is multi-platform, as is Pale Moon, and I tried the Linux and Windows versions, and they both worked absolutely fine for what they offered. I'm not sure about the availability on Apple platforms of any of this stuff, simply because I don't have access to an Apple box to test things on.
We don't care about that, do we?
I guess we don't. I mean, the Windows installer was really nice, actually, for QupZilla. It had a lot of good features in there to do with languages and what have you. We don't want to sort of spend too much time on the specifics. I was a little disappointed first time I loaded QupZilla, though. It doesn't prompt you to import bookmarks or anything from other browsers, but took you straight to a start page, which was a QupZilla theme start page using DuckDuckGo as the search engine.
Yeah, the first thing I tend to do is try DuckDuckGo and then realise that actually I don't like DuckDuckGo, and then go straight back to Google. And that unfortunately was the same thing with QupZilla. And you did say in the intro that it has multiple platforms, and while you may see multiple platforms as Linux, Windows, Mac, having looked at Pale Moon as well, which, as you say, we'll come to, that has Windows, Linux, and Android, and I'm not sure about Apple again, but so it has a more complete set of platforms in its arsenal.
Yeah, which I think is important if the browser in question offers facilities like bookmark syncing, history syncing, and what have you. But QupZilla didn't appear to do that.
No, exactly. So that's sort of a negative on QupZilla.
But if that was a bit disappointing, I mean, something I thought was a real positive for QupZilla was the fact that AdBlock was actually there out of the box.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. That was quite a nice touch, although not nice if you're a publisher, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, and as a browser, it seemed basically very functional. I mean, unlike Pale Moon, I could actually log into Pocket, for instance, using OAuth, which seemed to work quite well, and various other things like expanding Google Plus comment sections worked perfectly well. And again, they didn't in Pale Moon.
Well, I've got to say, an odd thing that I actually quite liked about QupZilla was the settings, which I know is a slightly boring thing to talk about, but it simply opened my eyes to how annoying I find the Chrome settings. I know they are half shown, and then you can show the advanced ones, but it's a bit like trying to find settings in Android. They're never that obvious as to where they are, and while I may have done something 3 months ago to change one particular feature, and I wish to change it back now, it's like I start from scratch, and never do I think, oh yeah, it's here or there or under this tab or what have you. But in QupZilla, they were quite nicely organised with a number of main sort of subdivisions on one panel. And then once you click on it, you get to choose a lot of the settings. And there seemed to be a lot of them as well. So you had real sort of granularity over what you wanted to allow. So you could sort of disallow Flash, you could disallow JavaScript, and it was really obvious and easy and like at the surface for you to do these things. Whereas I always just kind of find that in Chrome you're kind of rooting around trying to remember where that tick box was or where that pull down menu was, and I thought QupZilla did that really nicely.
Well, can we move on to some of the negative aspects of it? And I said it at the top there. What use is a browser if it won't load the pages that I need it to load? I mean, it's all well and good doing some light browsing with QupZilla, but I seldom use a web browser on a laptop, really. I mostly use it on my phone for light browsing like that. The only time I ever need a browser on a laptop is for things like Google Drive, so that I can edit show docs and that kind of thing. And Drive and Gmail were just not at all supported. I mean, they kind of vaguely loaded, but it just was not a nice experience. Okay, maybe you could blame Google for that, for making those too heavy and only supporting certain browsers. But to me, if you can't support those sites, you're irrelevant, and I'm not going to use your browser, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the speed aspect was one thing that really struck me, because it was drastically slower than what I'm used to with Chrome, and far, far slower than Pale Moon, which we're going to talk about.
Okay, so you've mentioned Pale Moon there, and I feel we should start talking about it. So Pale Moon has a slightly different way of getting started. I'll take it from there. So it's a case of downloading the tar file, extracting that, and you end up with an install script. So you just run the pm installer as a script, because it wasn't available in any of the package managers that I use, and so this is the only way of getting it on. It seemed a little bit odd that you couldn't just get it from an apt-get, but there we go. And once you run the script, it brings up a GUI with install, uninstall, update. You can view the readmes and things like this. And so you work your way through that, and it is fairly seamless. There's no real complexities there. And to counter the QupZilla intro that Paddy gave, when you boot it, it does ask you if you want to import your bookmarks and history and things like this. So that option is there, and it also asks if you want it to be the default browser, which is what pretty much all browsers do. But it was really the start page that kind of caught my eye, because whereas Chrome might have the Google page, Firefox and QupZilla have the sort of tiled intro page, this has a very, very elaborate, widget type page, and it'll have a bunch of add-ons. So it's got sort of a social little section, in which case under which it's got Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and things, an announcement section so they can talk to you about the project, and email services, media with things like Vine, YouTube, Spotify, resources, discovery widget, and so there's a whole load of these little boxes that you can move around as to your preference, and you can add even more that you can populate yourself, and you can choose how you want them arranged and what subsets you want within each one. So it had a really, really customizable start page, and as Paddy alluded to, Pale Moon has a much better syncing system, so you can actually set it up on your PC, and when you log in on a different PC, you can have that same start page tailored to your liking.
Yeah, well, all of this seems to be powered by a website called start.me, and it's very reminiscent of some of the portal and browser integration we saw back in the 90s.
Well, we haven't actually said what Pale Moon is, have we? And what it is Firefox, but with all of the cruft taken out. They've taken the Firefox code base, removed all of the horrible stuff like Pocket, optimized it, compiled it, and pushed it out. So if you're familiar with Firefox, you're pretty much going to be familiar with Pale Moon.
Yeah, the look and feel, and as I mentioned, the setting page on QupZilla, only is fair that I do the same, is exactly the same as Firefox. It has all the same icons and colorings and things like that. And the point about the start page that I wanted to get onto was, regardless of how it's set up and what it's loaded upon, there are a couple of subtle adverts within those widgets which you can get rid of if you sign up and pay. So in order to have it synced across devices, and as I said, it works on Android as well, you have to sign up. Now, the payment, the sign up is free and you get adverts, but it's currently $24 for lifetime subscription with no adverts. You can get support for any questions you have. They back up your data, and obviously you're contributing to it. So I was surprised that it was fairly close to the surface to have this, quite elegant front page, no matter how it's served. But then actually there was quite quickly it said, "Would you like to donate to us?" Which I thought was a little bit odd, and I suppose, open source projects need to be funded somehow, but I was surprised to see it with a browser.
Well, they don't have the oceans of cash sloshing around like Mozilla do for Firefox. So, yeah, they have to pay for it somehow. And maybe the donations model will work going forward, but you can't really fault them too much. I mean, the adverts aren't that obtrusive, are they?
Absolutely, they're fairly subtle, and you certainly aren't drawn to them in the same way that when you go to a website that has them cluttered all down the right-hand side that you see them.
You mentioned there that this is a stripped-down version of Firefox, if you like, with some of the cruft taken out. I mean, there was a fair bit of what some people would call cruft put back in again. I mean, it included plugins for viewing PDFs. VLC was included out of the box.
Well, you can disable those plugins and remove them, but yeah, I take your point that is a bit of cruft and bloat that it probably could do without.
Yeah, but plus side obviously is that with this being based on Firefox, all of your usual extensions and plugins will work, the things that you probably are used to using from Firefox. So I tried a Gmail message checker, uBlock Origin for ad blocking and things like that, and they all worked absolutely fine, which was great.
Except that I installed AdBlock Plus and it disabled it by default, and it said, oh, you do not want to be enabling this, oh, you're sure about that, oh, you definitely don't want to do it. Which, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that, because by default, it restricted what I wanted to do. But then again, I could go and override that. So I suppose it's a reasonable security setting. But yeah, you're right. You've got all of the Firefox extensions available to you. And generally speaking, they seem to work as well as in Firefox.
They also supply some things like themes from their own website, don't they?
Yeah, and this is in addition to the Firefox themes you can have. So I suppose it's quite nice that they allow you to pick and choose whether you're used to Firefox and you want the things that are there. But they've also expanded upon it slightly to allow their own personality to come through, if you will. So I've mentioned the fact that it's on Android, and I should maybe clarify for Phelim, who is probably desperately looking at his phone right now, it is not on F-Droid, so it is only on the Google Play Store, which I think is a trick they've missed there for mass adoption. Well, maybe not mass adoption, but certainly getting everyone on board who might want to use it.
And just to clarify a point from earlier, when Jesse mentioned the installer, I mean, the standard way of doing it is via this script, but there is actually a PPA available for it for Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of day-to-day usage then, I know you two are used to Chrome and the speed there. I'm used to Firefox and the sluggish, horrible performance. For me, Pale Moon was significantly faster than Firefox. Now, that may be because of profile bloat, because my Firefox profile has been growing and being transferred across machines for years and years and years. But it was like a breath of fresh air using this. It was so fast compared to Firefox. I'd also been testing Chrome alongside it. I've been testing Chrome a fair bit lately, just out of interest. And certainly with the Google services, unsurprisingly, that is much quicker. So, I mean, what are your guys' impression of the speed of it compared to Chrome? I mean, I know you've not really used Firefox much, so you can't really compare that. But compared to Chrome, how did you find it?
Funnily enough, the majority of my Chrome usage is on my Chromebook, which I suppose is kind of obvious, but odd that I have other laptops I use Chrome on. And when I think that Chrome is slow, I always put it down to the CPU it's running on, because I've just counted, I've got 10 applets installed that have icons on the top right-hand side, plus anything else which is running in the background, like AdBlock and things like this. And so I have quite a lot of cruft in Chrome. So I think that the Pale Moon browser was actually a bit quicker. And as I said earlier in the show, The Verge is my test case because it's such a horribly bloated and nasty website to go to. And it felt like it was loading quicker. So I would probably put that down to the fact that I'm used to Chrome being fairly slow because of the ARM Chromebook that I have. And so I'm sort of used to that. And like you say, it's the factor that I don't have any bloat on it at all, even though it comes pre-installed with some things. And just to put the record straight, or to put my opinion on what you said earlier, Joe, I like Pocket. I'm a big fan of Pocket. So the idea that Firefox installed Pocket by default doesn't bother me. I'd be on board with that. But the fact that Pale Moon comes with very few things installed meant that it was fairly quick and quite peppy. And on the Android side as well, I thought it was quite a nice browser there. I wasn't so impressed by QupZilla. It was not slow, but it wasn't quite as peppy as Pale Moon.
Okay, before I tell you about how I found it performance-wise, can we just back up to this Pocket issue? Because You did mention it, Joe, and it does come out of the box with standard Firefox, but isn't included in Pale Moon. Now, Jesse, did you try and actually install Pocket in Pale Moon?
No, so my Pocket use is specifically for doing this show and reading articles on the underground. So it is very much a case of, in fact, 2 of those 10 applets that I talked about in my Chrome install are for stripping web pages out and getting them into Pocket. So I didn't look at it for this review, no.
It's always good to have more than one view on things, just in case I hit a bug by mistake. Because Pocket wouldn't actually install for me in Pale Moon, because that is something I use every day, several times a day. Okay, well, let's just park that thought, but it did pop up an OAuth error, which didn't happen with QupZilla. So going back to the performance side of things, I used Pale Moon for about a week and a half alongside Chrome, and in my experience it was slightly slower but far more acceptable than a lot of other browsers I've looked at. But the interface was also slower, and I found this really annoying. I mean, I'm used in Chrome to be able to drag tabs around and do things like that and pop new instances of the browser open by dragging a tab off the actual tab bar. And all of that, you could actually see the pixels being redrawn when I was using Pale Moon. So the interface speed, I think, is horrible in comparison with Chrome.
Presumably the slowness with the interface has got to do with the move away from Zool then.
Yeah, it's hard to tell because I never was a big Firefox user back in the day, and obviously, as you say, Mozilla are moving away from that old way of doing things. But say it was certainly noticeable, the difference between Pale Moon and Chrome, doing things like just moving tabs about.
So I guess it's fair to say that these are straight alternatives for the major web browsers. They're not streamlined or slimmed down or lightweight. They are just a different version, and one may be your preference or one may work to your liking, but they're taking on the big dogs, aren't they?
I'm not sure I'd agree with what you said there, because Pale Moon, to me, just feels like a slimmed down version of Firefox. Although I suppose it's got other features in it as well, which mean that it's not just a slimmed down Firefox, although that might be how it started. It's kind of gone off in its own direction now. So maybe that's fair to say that it's competing with the big boys. But the question I've got to ask myself is, I'm fed up with Firefox and how slow it is. I've tried this out, but I've not switched to it. And the question is, why have I not switched to it? Is it just because I don't like change? Or is it because I find myself using Chrome more and more, especially for Google services like Maps, which just doesn't really work in Firefox anymore. It just crashes all the time. Why is it that I'm not using Pale Moon? I'd kind of been planning to switch to it for a while, but now having tried it, it was faster than Firefox. It felt nicer, but I don't know. I don't know why. I can't answer it. I can't put my finger on quite why I'm not using it. And maybe I should make an effort to use it full time for a while. And, you know, I can always go back to Firefox if I want to.
The answer, Joe, is that you know you want to be using Chrome. And I'm not saying that as a Chrome user. I'm saying that as someone who has listened to you for the last 20 minutes on the podcast. And all the way through this, you've been making references to Chrome as the superior browser, or as a browser that you think you should move to. So, for example, in one of your intros, you said Paddy and I had made the switch over, or made the sensible switch, or something, or transitioned over to Chrome, as if you had been left behind and you hadn't quite caught up with the cool crowd. All the way through. I think if you re-listen to this, you'll hear yourself sort of knowing that you should really be using Chrome, but you feel like you're sort of a little bit too Luddite to make that big transition.
It's not about being Luddite and not wanting to change. It's about the fact that Chrome's proprietary. And yeah, I could use Chromium, but then what makes Chrome better than Chromium and what makes it probably arguably the best browser is the proprietary stuff, is the fact that Hangouts is going to work. I can talk to my wife when we're not together, and, you know, I can use Maps perfectly, and Flash is there for the few sites that still use it. But it's that proprietary barrier. That's why I'm not using Chrome, because although I accept that it is essentially the best browser available on Linux, it's proprietary, and I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not going to make the switch to something proprietary unless I absolutely have to, and I can still use Chromium and Firefox, even though they're not quite as good. So it's sacrificing ease of use and functionality for my principles of trying to use free software. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com or phone us on Twitter, Google+, or Facebook, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, homies.
See you later.